So good evening here in House Maryon at the Goethe Annum, and hopefully in many other places. Welcome to our evening about Ernst Muller, a Jewish philosopher and an anthroposophist and a teacher of the Kabbalah of the Zohar. We commemorated his birthday some days ago, so 21st of November, by two contributions from the general anthroposophical section here in a serial of lectures about Jewish humanism. And Constanza Calix gave a lecture about his introduction, as he called it, to the Zohar, the holy book of the Kabbalah, and myself presented some days ago an introduction to his biography. And we will do the same tonight. I will begin now, tell you a little bit about the story of his life and his striving, and hope we get a certain inner relationship to him. And later on, Constanza will go on with her presentation. So he died on the 5th of August 1954 in London, and yes, the situation there at the burial in Golders Green Jewish congregation and cemetery was in so far astonishing that there were many anthroposophists, but also many Orthodox Jews and liberal Jews and Jewish Christians. So a mixed audience is not the right word, a mixed group being present there. The ceremony was held by a rabbi, of course. It was Max Eschelbacher, a close friend of Ernst Muller. Or in addition, 1 week later, and this was also the wish of Ernst Muller, there was an act of consecration of man for him in the Christian community in London. So in a way, untypical, building bridges, connecting Judaism and anthroposophy and Christianity, spiritual Christianity, and as Hans-Jürgen Braker wrote, the specialist, I would say the specialist for Ernst Muller here in Germany and Middle Europe, he said it was a sacred duty for him. And he tried to fulfill it throughout his whole life as an adult person, to bridge in between Judaism, spiritual esoteric Judaism, anthroposophy, but also spiritual Christianity. We will hear about it. And 2 years before he died, he published a very wonderful essay, astonishing till today, My Path Through Judaism and Christianity. Through, that means, yes, he passed it in a way, and so interesting to get him to know. He's still famous, I can't say, not in the public media, but in those who are interested in the Zohar and the Kabbalah. His book, The Zohar and Its Teachings, Introduction to the World of Kabbalah, is still available, also in German, by a Swiss publisher. And also the later book about the Holy Book of Kabbalah, text of the Zohar, translated by himself, published first in Vienna in 1932, is still available. And also he's famous or well known for his history of Jewish mysticism, published in Oxford, in the exile in London, 1946. But we also know him for many other articles and texts about music, about higher mathematics. We know him as a translator, as a poet, a highly gifted man, and not only the spectrum of his themes, but also the range of the journals, Jewish journals, Christian journals, anthroposophical journals, they published him. A very adorable, amiable person, very humble, very modest, struggling with a professional career, which he never really achieved, after he decided not to become a rabbi. And also some strugglings in his personal life, quite often, I think, unhappy in love, in relationships. And he said later in his writings about his life and his encounters with Dr. Steiner, unfortunately, I too often made the mistake of bringing personal difficulties to Dr. Steiner that I could not handle on my own. He would then always give only vague, general advice, always in such a way that he did not interfere with my freedom. They had many conversations. I will come back to this topic. Very important scientific themes, study themes, esoteric themes, but always also his personal situation. Too often, he said later, but maybe it was needed. So they had really a scientific exchange. And also Rudolf Steiner showed him the path to many other important scientists and authors. So he supported contacts to contemporary scientists, as let's say Oscar Simoni, who was a famous mathematician at University Vienna, or the person we know quite well here in Dornach, Elisabeth Frede, who was the leader of the section here for mathematics, astronomy. Also Neville Meakin, a very also gifted man, doing also research in mathematics, in special themes. And recently a biography was published by Steve Roberts from Sheffield in a magazine, Farther In, about Neville Meakin. We know him more or less a little bit here in Dornach from Edith Maryon, because Edith Maryon, coming from London, she came from a circle. There was Neville Meakin, there was Dr. Falkin, Rosicrucians, and now in this newest publication of Steve Roberts, there is much more. And Steiner advised Meakin to contact Ernst Muller in Vienna, and they had letter exchange about these special mathematical and spiritual challenges. So just to say, Steiner also advised him to certain people with special interests and especially special virtues, faculties, special intelligences, and also advised him to read this book or very special advices in the context of literature, philosophy. And Emil Bock, the priest of the Christian community, he encouraged the late Ernst Müller to write down his memories, because especially the encounters with Steiner, Bock was extremely interested as a biographer of Steiner, and that's what he did then later on. Yeah, a friend of him from Vienna wrote in a good way, "It is true that Müller did not live entirely on the physical plane, so to speak, and was touchingly helpless in matters of practical life. This was always also reflected in his indifference to his clothing and in the unimaginable disorder of his study room, in which, however, he found his way quite well." So he was not living in an established order, but created his own creative surrounding, but struggling certain times. So I will give you a certain introduction in his biography now, which started in a little town in a region which we call South Moravia, Südmähren in German, a little town, formerly Mittendorf, German Myslitz, and today Miroslav, which is now belonging to the Czech Republic. 3,000 inhabitants, and from the late Middle Age, quite a Jewish congregation. So the first Jews were noted or documented in 1332, so in the first third of the 14th century. And in the 15th or 16th century, they were almost half of the population. And so he grew up in a really old Jewish family. So both parents, father and mother, were children of a rabbi, of two rabbis. But they changed their path. So father did not become another rabbi, but a doctor. So Isidor Israel Muller was a good house doctor, family doctor, and also with his carriage going to the countryside. Quite often the little boy was sitting beside him, Ernst, who was the youngest of 3 children, siblings. He has a sister, Clara, and a bigger brother, Edmund. He was the youngest, with reddish hair, beloved by the other ones. And about the mother, it is said that she was incredibly, or that she was intensively gifted in music, as also Ernst later, playing the piano. And he always underlined the warmth and the security of this home family. They were living a long time together. Yes, and it started in this little town there, Myslitz. So they came from traditional Jewish families, but they left in a way. Ernst Müller said they kept only a kind of a pious inner attitude to religious life. Even if father was reading with his son also the Old Testament, but the way to the synagogue obviously was the way of the youngest son, his own way. He felt after a certain age maybe called to become a rabbi, and he was quite serious in going to the synagogue and following the rules, the traditional Jewish rules, and it was not given or not ordered by the parents. A humanistic family, so not only Isaiah and the Old Testament, but also German literature played an important role from the beginning. He, Ernst, adored Schiller, but many others, authors. Yes. Maybe I can overjump some things. It's very interesting, his childhood and youth, and he was a very good scholar at school. And just to mention that age 17, that means he's born in 1880. In 1869, he first heard a lecture of Theodor Herzl. We can maybe say the founder of the national state in Palestine, the Jewish state. And in 1897 there was the first Zionist Congress nearby Dornach, or let's say Dornach is nearby Basel, in the casino. The first Zionist Congress organized by Herzl with the decision to intend such a national state. Ernst Müller, 17 years of age, did not attend the Congress. He was not invited. There were representatives of many countries, but not him, of course. But he heard a lecture of Theodor Herzl when he was 17, and from then on followed the path of Zionism. But he, from the beginning, had a certain distance to political Zionism, for him, you will hear about it, more important was the cultural Zionism. The family, maybe after he finished school, maybe to enable him to go to university, moved to Vienna altogether. And he jumped into university life. And he said later, yes, I studied law, but in fact all other topics. So there was literature, philosophy, music, and in fact it was too much for him. He said, I lost my orientation, not only at university, but also, let's say, he said the moral foundation, or the foundation of my moral thinking. Especially he mentioned Nietzsche, very fascinating for him, Zarathustra, the same Dostoevsky, but in a way also obviously facilitating a certain chaotic state in his own, I would say, religious soul. So, and he said it was a severe crisis. I was close to madness. He was befriended with Otto Weininger, who later on committed suicide. And he said, I wasn't very far from this point. But he went to a kind of a sanatorium and made deep inner experiences. And also he said there was some, how to say, some grace coming to me, guiding thoughts and guiding lines. He had to stop to study, so mental work was stopped. But then his brother, a little bit older, Edmund, discovered theosophy and brought books and ideas to his younger Ernst. But also he discovered a very important old book by Feuchtersleben, a doctor and a philosopher of the old Vienna culture, Dietetic of the Soul. It is a schooling book about balancing your own soul with meditative exercises, but I would say re-encouraging or encouraging your will capacity. So a self-discipline. So he was not in a sanatorium where they really treated him with pharmacological substances. It was more cold water. But I think the main therapy was these books and inner exercises. So he found his balance, again went back to university, but then he went on to study philosophy, mathematics and physics. He was very gifted also in natural science, but he said these exact sciences, I realized them as a kind of a fundament, a kind of a spiritual security. And the idea was to come to a teaching profession later. Of course, he still heard other lectures in this interesting Vienna University at the beginning of the 20th century. Also other lectures by Herzl, not at university, but public. And he said also this idea of Zionism strengthened and transformed my physical soul condition. So as a kind of maybe a utopia, but in the sense of Ernst Bloch. Or let's say an ideal, that means, Steiner said, an idea with an aspect of a will character. So not just an idea, but something wanted to be incarnated, and so on. He had an early meeting in 19 with Martin Buber, who became one of the most prominent, I'd say, representative of this cultural Zionism, of this renewal of Jewish religion, religious sources, inner soul life. And then Ernst Muller co-organized a Zionist students group and became very active. had also a close girlfriend. Maybe he fell in love, I don't know, with a young woman, and she came from an East European family and brought a little bit to him, or not only a little bit, brought to him this spiritual culture of Eastern Judaism. Cultural Zionism, but Achat Ha'am and other writings, and which were also so fascinating for Franz Kafka later, and many other, also German Jewish philosophers. Also Gershom Scholem discovered in Berlin the East European Jewish and Yiddish culture. So a rich world, longing for it, and he was also then meeting Hugo Bergman. It was the first short meeting in '93. Later on they met 8 years later in Prague, and Bergman was our last theme in this series of lectures of Jewish humanists, very important. Later on at the university on Mars Corpus. Important for us here in the Goethe-Ahnung because he was a student, a scholar of anthroposophy, deeply interested in Steiner's work, very independent in his search. Also he was a scholar of Sri Aurobindo, and mainly he was a philosopher and well educated, and also had the chair of philosophy at Mount Corpus University. And when was Steiner's 100th birthday in 1961, he organized 1 week about Steiner's philosophy at the Hebrew University. He was a close companion, I would say a friend of Ernst Muller. The friendship started in 1911 in Prague, and it remained during the whole life, even longer, I would say. So he made his PhD in philosophy, problems of consciousness. It was under Laurens Müller. Laurens Müller was a professor of philosophy, highly estimated by Steiner, by the way. And then he started his first teaching career, which never became a career. So only 6 months he was tolerated or accepted as a teacher. Obviously there was a lack of authority. At least this was the major criticism against him. And he had to stop teaching, did not know where to go. And then he had to go to the military service, which was horrible for him. Such a peaceful soul against all militarism, against all nationalism, and now being part of the Austrian army for a certain time. It was a crash, he said. And then where to go? Now he was 27. Parents were a little bit in sorrow. What about Ernst? So gifted, so nice, adorable, but what kind of profession? So he made an application for the Hebrew gymnasium in Jaffa, Palestine. Maybe they need me there. He was excellent in Hebrew, so he could easily speak it. He was very gifted in languages in general. And they accepted him. He came by the Netherlands because he had a little job on a Zionist Congress in The Hague as a stenographer, and get to know the organization, the Zionist organization. But then suddenly he was in the Holy Land. And the first experience, obviously, of him was the landscape, total unfamiliar, so different, and he felt poorly at home. He said it must have been a kind of a Urerinnerung, primal memory. He felt completely at home, and he was deeply touched by the other emigrants or immigrants from the point of view. It was the second Aliyah, the second escape stream from Eastern Europe mainly. 35,000 mostly young people escaped partly from pogroms, from kind of oppression, mainly East Europe at this time. And a lot of them were young socialists, but not in the sense of Marx, I would say in the sense of the heart. The longing for a new brotherhood, for living together, for working together. And even if they came out of different nations and have different beliefs, for Muller it was a deep experience. Now they were all together, and he said, I had a feeling of purely human, purely human. I never came first to this experience, purely human. So he felt, well, the landscape and this special surrounding, they were all new in this new land. And he went to school in Jaffa, another 6 months at a grammar school. He said a continuation of my pedagogical failures, but he also said it was more from the outside. This school was in a very difficult situation, but maybe he was not the best teacher to get it well done, or I don't know. He was very gifted, but maybe not in leading the class, but maybe they mistrust or underestimated his special faculties, I don't know. At the end he had to leave, and how to earn money. He gave private tuition, he got some support from Edmund, the brother. What to do? He visited some of these agricultural settlements for the future, still felt completely at home, and then had a very deep impression of Jerusalem in summer 98. That means he was 28 years old, or achieving 28. He said it was just wonderful, even if there was a lack of water, there was excessive dust and heat, and a lot of people, he himself had fever, so very difficult life conditions. But Jerusalem, the holy city. Nevertheless, that means the heat and the fever. I often walked for hours in the shadeless surroundings of Jerusalem. I had made it a habit to walk along the city wall for several hours, or to take in the indescribable view of the old city from the Mount of Olives, as if with all my heart. So in a way, he was deeply impressed by this site, and he said by the old holy places of Judaism, but also by the Christian memorials, so Via Dolorosa and all other places. Not only in Jerusalem, also Emmaus. He described very wonderful an evening atmosphere in Emmaus. And he said, later on, I've read the Gospels, and they described the same. Not exactly the same, but he said it was in the atmosphere. But maybe the culmination was not this, and not also another time at a school in Lydda, an orphanage school where he spent some time. The culmination for him was a little very special city. He visited Safed. This is close to the Lake Gennesaret, and this was an old town of Kabbalah. So in the Middle Age, in the late Middle Age decades, there were Kabbalistic schools there. So the center was Isaac Luria, but also a lot of scholars, and it is still existing there in the air, in the atmosphere, in the streets. It's totally different now, but if you go along the old streets there, it is still in a way present. The folk tradition said the Messiah will come in Safed. Isa Wigman also visited Safed and the mount behind, and it is still worth to go there. And he was deeply touched and started directly to write not a poem but a novel about Isaac Luria. He said, I did not know a lot about him, but I had dreams. He was really a dreamer, not a pure dreamer. He was also a scientist, but he had enormous dreams. Let's say about Isaac Luria in this city, and started a novel. He finished it, I think, 14 years later, in the time of when Dr. Steiner died. So that means in springtime 1925, I think he finished it. But it was for him the onset of his studies in the esoteric Zohar Kabbalah source of Judaism. Zohar means radiance of light. And a glimpse of this light, a glimpse of this new light he got there first. Together with a very wonderful writer, Jewish writer, Agnon. He got a Nobel Prize later with Nelly Sachs, by the way, but if you come across his writings, it must have been wonderful to be together with this man, which has also an East European origin and another name originally, to go there to Safed. And Ernst Muller was also a translator of Agnon and of Bialik. So Agnon is sending he is writing Hebrew, but Ernst Muller transformed it into German, and then Agnon sent it to Martin Buber to publish from Jaffa, one of his poems. And also the translations of Chaim Bialik became very famous of Ernst Muller. And he described in a night, I think in Safed still, he was sleeping outside because it was too hot. And the moon was full there. And in that very night, he suddenly had a feeling, I had to go home to see my parents. He was related deep in the heart and had the feeling I had to go home, even if I'm here at home forever. I don't know if maybe he only had in mind a visit, but he never came back to Palestine. And before he could go, he became ill with malaria. So he was also weakened, but later on he managed. In June 1999, he came home. Brother waited for him at the train station in Vienna. Back home, 29 years old, where to go? Did not know. Brother took him to a theosophical study group, a good one. And the main teacher was a woman there, and she taught about Steiner's teaching. And Muller first time had a feeling there is a new spiritual science. There is a modern spiritual science. This is not what he grasped as theosophy at the beginning of the 20th century from Franz Hartmann. No, this was a new spiritual science. So he went to this study group. Sometimes, his brother always. He was totally devoted, Brother Edmund, to the theosophical study group. But he was a person, he was a guest. Not his whole life, but Ernst Muller was a person, he was not fixed on this theosophical group. He was deeply interested, but also left it again and came back. He studied Hebrew mysticism, visited Buber, who invited him, and he said, go deeper. So, but also he made, again, Plato studies. It was very interesting for him because he studied Plato when he studied philosophy, But after this Palestine experience, he came back to Plato in a different inner soul mood. He said there was a transformation of my soul I couldn't describe, but now I was reading Plato meditative, and sometimes only very short parts of the book, but I meditated on them. And I also had a new inner understanding of the Bible, an understanding from within. And the outer life was how to earn money. So yes, he gave Bible instruction to a young Rothschild relative, or so he was engaged several times by people who needed him as a house teacher, or there was a rabbi in Salzburg who wanted to make a PhD, and he had to teach the rabbi. The rabbi, in fact, wanted that Muller is writing the PhD for him. Muller didn't want to write a second PhD for the rabbi, and so on. So many, many funny stories. And then Dr. Steiner came, giving lectures at Vienna. It was springtime 1910, so he was becoming 30 years old, Muller. Macrocosmos and microcosmos. The connection, the interconnection between the human being and his cosmos surrounding was the main topic with many details. And Müller's memories about the lectures, I had the immediate feeling that this man, whose outward appearance and speech reminded me of Fichte, the philosopher, he was speaking from direct spiritual experience. The impression affected even my sleep and dream life, in which something like a deep wakefulness lived. So he was going to the lectures, but he was also dreaming and kind of awakening in the night. In one of these dreams of Steiner, Steiner said to him, you know, the brain thinks. And this was a shock in a way for Muller, because he had the feeling that the soul is thinking and not the brain. But in the dream, Steiner said the brain thinks. So this kind of, maybe also, what is the connection between the brain and the thinking soul? But it was so deep that even in the dream state, the awakened dream state, it was the beginning of a lifelong conversation with Rudolf Steiner, who immediately struck me as an initiate, Ernst Muller wrote in another memory. But also, they had the first personal encounter after the lecture, or after one of the lectures, and he said this audience became a live event. Amazingly, Steiner showed insight into my life so far, which he could not have gained from outside sources. He even gave me astonishing advices regarding the immediate present. He was essentially familiar with the course of my life. So he knew him, but he had no clue where from. So he gave advices, and these advices were maybe directed to a certain life balance, but also advices how to go on with his studies. And to summarize this, from this moment on, they have a long conversation about mathematics, higher mathematics, spiritual significance of numbers, geometry, but also about Kabbalah and Zohar, and the esoteric background of Judaism, and further dimensions of spiritual science, I would say. One of his favorite themes of Muller was harmony. Harmony in the sense of mathematics, in geometry, but also in music, but also about Plato and the tradition of Pythagoras, and. So this was from the first meeting on. an ongoing conversation with many very important hints by Steiner. Yeah. And so from this point on, when he had the chance to go to a lecture to Steiner, if Steiner was coming to Vienna or was lecturing in Munich, he had a chance to go. Munich was not so far away than Oslo, so he preferred Munich. And there was, in the same year, in summer, a wonderful course of Steiner's Secrets of Biblical Creation Story. Die Geheimnisse der biblischen Schöpfungsgeschichte. And this was now a theme for the creation of the world from the perspective of the Bible, the Old Testament, and yes, Judaism. And he said in the memories, I found something strange, some Hebrew word interpretation contradictory, but the whole powerful style of this presentation seemed to have grown out of direct contact with ancient Hebrew mysteries. So in a way, he did not agree with some of Steiner's interpretation of old Jewish words, but he said the whole direction or the whole background was so true and was so deep. And again, they met in a personal conversation and some hints to other books, Agrippa von Nettesheim and so on. And yes, so he became familiar more and more, and he was studying anthroposophy, but also the Kabbalah, and as I said to you, music and mathematics, and deepened and got new friends. In artists, I only wanted to mention Richard and Hilde Pollack. Her name was at this time Kotani from Hungary. He came from Prague, two painters. They had an atelier, a studio in Vienna. They were both seekers of spiritual science. Later on, they were very important here at the Goetheanum for painting of the cupolas. After Dr. Steiner died, they went back to Prague. They were both deported to Theresienstadt. They didn't want to save their lives because they said we share the destiny of our Jewish home folk, because the anthroposophists in Prague, they wanted to save them from the deportation. There was a chance also for the priest of the Christian community, Joseph Adamet. But Richard Pollack said, no, we want to go the way of our people. And Richard Pollack was the anthroposophist who gave more than 100 lectures about anthroposophy in Theresienstadt concentration camp. As you know, there was a kind of a subcultural life, so rabbis, also the famous Leo Beck, gave lectures there under very, very primitive, moderate conditions, and Pollack about anthroposophy. They both died in Treblinka later. So, yeah, one of these hard destinies, and which escaped Ernst Muller by his late escape to London, but they had a good time together in Vienna. And I could name many more, the Lissaus, the brothers Lissau, and so on, and many other anthroposophists. There were quite a lot of them were Jewish and Zionists at this time in Vienna. So he felt at home, but not completely. I said he regarded himself always a little bit as a guest, or as a tolerated outsider in the anthroposophical society. It was not named, it was named Theosophical at this time, but also later he said they never really understood why I was still deepening my knowledge or my search into the Kabbalah and the Zohar, because they had anthroposophy. Steiner understood completely, but they not. Apart from that, he maybe was a kind of an outsider. Also these incredible talents maybe I should mention that he was quite often invited from from a society for mathematics, university, so they asked him for a lecture, and the same in philosophy. So he had no classical profession, but he was invited. But Steiner in Munich asked about the profession. With great kindness, Steiner himself, it came by Steiner, brought up the question of my external existence and lovingly endeavored to advise me on my professional situation, discussing three possibilities. First, to return to teaching at secondary school, or to expand the magazine. He was working for a Palestine magazine, even though I myself felt somewhat uncertain and ashamed and knew from my first conversation about Steiner's critical attitude towards Herzl's Zionism. Steiner was no fan of Herzl and the state, a Jewish state, a national state in Palestine. He was touched by the cultural Zionism, but maybe not a new national state, because Steiner thought that the time of national states is in general over, and it's not a good idea to found a new national state in Palestine. And that also he had a feeling that the Jews, they are necessary in Europe and they shouldn't emigrate. This was in 1897, so years ago. But he, in the first meeting with Steiner in 1909, asked about Zionism. Steiner was deeply interested in Müller's experiences in Palestine, also spiritually, but didn't want to talk so much about the political Zionism. And now he said there is an option that you intensify your work in the magazine Palestine, but Müller thought, but Steiner was no fan of this. And the third option was also strange for Müller. Finally, he mentioned a career as a librarian would suit me very well. And he said, I never thought in the direction of a librarian. But some weeks later, a visitor came to his parents, a cousin, in fact, of Ernst Muller. His name was Bernhard Münz. He was the director of the Jewish library. And he suggested to Müller's parents that Ernst could be a volunteer in the library of the Jewish community, which in fact was the largest and most important Jewish library in whole Europe at this time, as the congregation in Vienna was the biggest. And this became then a lifelong professional work for Ernst Muller until the Nazis came and sealed, that heißt closed with brutality, the door, and at the end destroyed, not complete, but most of the library. Almost 28 years he worked in this library, and it was very important because in a way, he said, despite my personal attachment to disorder, I loved creating objective order. So he loved the order in the books of the library, even he was not able to do it at home with his own surrounding. And also many visitors, very interesting what the people needed for books. And of course the books themselves. The wisdom of the books, the treasures of Jewish wisdom. And not only Jewish, he could also recommend to get other books in the library. They had enough money at this time. So it was a good job for 28 years, till November 1938. Now I try to summarize a little bit, which is very difficult. I wanted to mention some highlights, maybe only this. Prague, March 1911, occult physiology, Steiner's big course, and also lectures about philosophy, anthroposophy, the meeting with the Czech intelligence, and which was in fact a Jewish intelligence, more or less. The second and longest meeting and the beginning of the friendship with Hugo Bergman, and they directly starting to translate the Zohar together in collaboration, published 2 years later by Bergman. This is the essay, The Sanctification of the Name. Deep, and I want to quote this, a conversation with Steiner about Christ. Because he said, it was not so easy for me to accept the anthroposophical image of Christ. And then they had a meeting in a hotel, the same room where Steiner met Kafka, by the way. When I visited Dr. Steiner, the conversation turned to the Christ problem, which caused difficulties for Jewish listeners. When I remarked that this was also the case for me, Dr. Steiner smiled and said that this should not be a problem, as I could investigate the significance of that event through astronomical calculation. Something changed in the earth and the surrounding by this event. And he knew that Muller was also gifted in astronomy, and he said, if you do deeper studies in astronomy, you will see that there was a turning point. Something happened, which is not a question of belief or confession. Go on to study it. I don't know how far he studied this one, Lily Kolisko did, but an important conversation, and many more in Munich with the mystery dramas, very important also, the content of the mystery dramas and all of that. Important also, a Zionist Congress in Vienna in 1912. Also Franz Kafka took part, Ahad Ha'am, but also Chaim Bialik, Hugo Bergman, Berta Fanta, and there was the decision taken to found a university, a Hebrew university in Jerusalem, which was opened the 1st of April 1925. So Steiner died the 30th of March, and 1st of April, this university, a site of hope, of humanism, and deepening spiritual, not only spiritual, but also spiritual Jewish culture, and many other important things. Horrible, the First World War, 4 years, not being on the front. He had a good destiny in the back. So at the end, he was preparing field bakeries in Albania. So remote tasks, remote, far distant from, but 4 years. Fortunately, he could go on with his studies in the Zohar and also in the Psalms, but of course 4 years away from everything. And coming back, he met a different anthroposophical movement, because when he came to Stuttgart, he realized the Waldorf school opened. And he came to Dornach, and he saw here, in the beginning of September, the first Goetheanum as a school for spiritual science soon will be opened. And he thought of moving to Stuttgart as a teacher, or maybe they could need him here in Dornach. He was deeply fascinated by this new building, and he said, for me it was a wonder of the future, living and loving. He really said that the forms of the first Goetheanum, they had so much love in themselves. It was living and loving as architecture, and he felt deeply touched by it. Coming home from the Goetheanum, there was the book coming from the printer about the Zohar, the teachings of the Zohar, and I think maybe the first copy he sent to Dornach, only 2 weeks after he left Dornach, and dedicated to Rudolf Steiner, the wise man of profound path. And in the foreword, he thanked Martin Buber and Hugo Bergmann, and first of all, Rudolf Steiner, who first pointed me to the hidden fact of global occult science. Global, not only anthroposophical occult science, but cosmopolitan occult science, living as the esoteric core in different religions, different worldviews. And he said, yeah, study it and go on. And he helped him. They had also really many conversations about the Hebrew alphabet and the mysteries in the numbers of the alphabet, and so on, and so on. So the book was there, the Goetheanum was opened, and he had his first book, and went on. He asked Steiner in a letter if he is okay with the Hebrew translation of his book, The Key Point of the Social Question, die Kernpunkte der sozialen Frage. And in Hebrew, because this could be the concept for this new society in Palestine. And in fact, it was Hugo Bergmann who published the first Hebrew article about threefolding the society. And we found out that Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization, made visit to Steiner in Dornach, asking for advice or for a conversation, probably led by Hugo Bergmann and accompanied. I only wanted to say that Steiner, with empathy, realized what they were trying to do. He kept his sorrows also by the fact that, as Bergmann published in an article in 1911 in the journal of Muller, Palestine, this was not an empty country. And Bergmann said this was a basic misunderstanding of Herzl, that this is an empty country. There were 500,000 of Arabs living there, and it was a first article of Bergmann about how to foster friendship, how to come into a close cultural association with the neighbors. Later on, Hannah Arendt said they should not make a strong connection to Great Britain or to the United States as the world power organizations, but to their neighbors. At this time, maybe it would have been possible. But it's interesting, in Müller's Palestine organ in 1911, when they met in Prague, Hugo Bergmann published this article about, yes, how to create neighborhood. Because the roots of the Jewish culture and religion and of the Arab population is not so far away. So and Bergmann said, we have to learn the language, we have to teach also their contents, and so on. Just to mention it, so Steiner kept his skepticism because he said, if it's going to get a national state with borders and an inner identity, and with the protection of the German Empire, which was the hero for Herzl at a certain point, and then the Sultan, the Turkish Empire, and later on the English Empire, and finally, still today, the United States of America, this won't be fruitful. But Steiner obviously talked to Chaim Weizmann and to Hugo Bergmann, and later on, there was a long interview, and Steiner had given to a famous co-worker, one of the earliest of Herzl's co-workers, Hermann Kadisch, in Vienna. A long interview was published in the leading journal of Vienna. Kadisch asked Steiner in June 1922, what do you think about the Jewish question? And Steiner talked about neighborhood and about overcoming nations, developing trust, mutual trust, and of the importance of the Jewish people. And he said this importance is not fulfilled yet. So it's not only the old importance in the sense of preparing Christianity or what else. There is an actual importance between West and East. He said, as a mediator, here in Europe, but maybe also in Palestine, for those who want to emigrate. And for the other ones, he really said that Jewish Renaissance is not exhausted by Palestine. So it shouldn't be all there. It is maybe necessary for those who want to go, but there is a major task also in Europe and maybe worldwide. It's a very interesting interview. It was published 2 years ago for the first time in one of the collected works of Steiner with collected interviews. I think Peter Barner found it, I don't know anymore, from the Rudolf Steiner archive. So the last years of Dr. Steiner, he missed the Christmas conference. Ernst Muller, he missed, better to miss it, the burning of the Goetheanum, but kept a strong, or developed a very strong connection with the new School for Spiritual Science, founded at the Christmas conference, especially to the section for astronomy and mathematics. In the last meeting they had in Prague, Steiner advised him to become a member of the School for Spiritual Science, and he directly sent in a letter, but unfortunately couldn't go to the class lessons Steiner gave in Prague because he had no more holidays from the library. So he missed Steiner's 2 class lessons in Prague, but went on to go to the class lessons, for those who know, the spiritual lessons of the School for Spiritual Science, by Count Paul Sohoditz, until the last one given when the Nazis came, 11th of March 1938. In that night, it was the last class lesson he visited, he heard in Vienna, but he went on with the class lessons in London, and very interesting, very late, he became a husband. That means he married Frida, also from Vienna. She came later to him, and they married and were a very, very happy couple. But to the wedding in the synagogue, Ernst came from a class lesson from Rudolf Steiner house. It's very interesting for him to come from a class lesson to the Jewish ritual of marriage. I jumped now because this was in 1941, if I'm right. Yes, I'm right. So Steiner died, and he went on with the Goetheanum, also insofar that he was almost every year here, from 1926 on till 34, and gave lectures here in the glass house about mathematics, astronomy, but also 2 lectures about the Kabbalah here in Dornach, 1931, Kabbalah and Judaism. Interesting, he was also reading a new Hebrew translation of the Gilgamesh epic here in Dornach. Quite interesting. To make it now very short, the end, the last 5 minutes, he didn't come anymore from 34 on, because Ita Wegmann, he visited to Arlesheim here for medical problems. He knew her, and especially Elisabeth Frede. They lost their positions at the Goetheanum in a lot of, in a situation of internal fights, and for Muller this was so ugly. He couldn't believe that this happened in an anthroposophical society. He decided no more to go to Dornach. He went on with anthroposophy and with the class lessons, I said, in Vienna, and with work in the library. There was a lot of things happening with books and Friedrich Eckstein and so on, until the Nazis came, or better to say, they came in March 1938. And for Muller, it was horrible because there was a lot of enthusiasm in the city, a possession, he said. a fanatism. It was not that that the military just occupied. There were a lot of Hakenkreuze all around the city. This kind of enthusiasm, this kind of, for him it was, they were all mad. Of course, they were not all, but a lot of Austrians. And so he could go on with his work for several months, but on the 10th of November, the day when all the synagogues burned and they sealed the library. So this was the end. He was described in these months there as totally calm, without any fear. He walked almost cheerfully through the agitated crowd. He strove to recognize the root cause of that demonic barbarism, and those who seek to recognize have no fear, said a director of a school who knew him quite well, Viktor Kellner. So obviously he was not afraid. Maybe also a guest in this sense or in this situation. And finally, he could escape to London late, that means in June 39, by the help of Elisabeth Frede, who sent George Adams from London to Vienna to save the lives. And because, yeah, they could only come to the Switzerland if they have a permit to London. The Swiss government didn't want to keep them here, the Jews. So all Adams organized a permit to London. He could come to Switzerland, and by the Goetheanum, he came to London. Yes, I'm right. The wedding happened in 1941. He was age 61. The wife was 20 years younger. They knew each other from Vienna. And Rabbi Max Eschelbacher said when he died, this was the good angel on his side. What he did in London in the exile years, just to end, he went on to work with his publications, with his studies. He gave courses, lectures about the Kabbalah in the Jewish Lehrhaus, the teaching house in London. Published a big book about Jewish history of Jewish mysticism in 1946, encouraged by Hugo Bergman, who said the school of Sholem, they are only studying the history of the manuscripts. They are not really posed the question of the truth of mystical phenomena. This maybe does not apply for Sholem, but he remains silent on this subject. That means Gershom Scholem was the scientist of the Kabbalah, but nobody really knew if he was a Kabbalist or only a scientist of the Kabbalah. Not only, but he was. But maybe he was. But Bergman said at least the scholars of Scholem, they are not really interested in the truth of the phenomena. They only look for the papers and the age of the papers and so on. And what's so important, if you, Ernst Muller, raise the question of truth in your book and refer to Steiner or establish a connection to him, this is a great achievement. So he encouraged him to bring it together, not to make it identical. Anthroposophy is not Kabbalah, but maybe an enlightenment. I would say a mutual enlightenment. It is not only the case that anthroposophy maybe opens a light for Kabbalah, but also reverse, I would say. But this is my own interpretation. I want to say he went on in studying, in teaching. I would say from a religious perspective, it was a life in divine teaching. That does not mean that he's always the teacher, but he was also living in divine teaching. He was a son of faith in the sense of the Zohar. That means a unity of knowledge and faith, as he describes it in his own text, Zohar. He was also a teacher of priests of the Christian community who came to him for advices. He had study groups. And George Adams said he was very ill, I forgot to say. He had a lung bleeding in Vienna, became tuberculosis. Imagine a very old, he was aged then, but he was ill. And he couldn't leave anymore the apartment. And the last 2 years he couldn't leave anymore the bed. But visiting him, George Adams said, again and again one came away from hours spent at Dr. and Mr. Muller's hospitable fireside, refreshed not only spiritually but in soul and body. So the visitor, George Adams, felt refreshed not only in spirit but also in soul and body, having been hours in conversation with the Mullers. Yes, maybe time is really over. Just to mention that the rabbi who did the funeral service said 1 year before, Muller said to me, the rabbi, you know, in death, the body becomes the outside world. And he was so fascinated by this sentence that Muller said, in death, the body becomes the outside world. So this metamorphosis, this thought was for him totally anew. And I end with a quotation, and I don't know if it's from Max Eschelbacher himself, the rabbi who performed the ritual, or from another one, maybe it's also from Harold Reinhardt. And it's a speech 4 years after the burial. It's a speech in setting the stone, because 4 years later the gravestone was, and there was a wonderful report of this also ritual in the New London Jewish Congregation member letter, and I end with this quote. The man who did it, I don't know, Eschelbacher or Reinhardt, because it's not named, but it is a kind of a ceremony. As I read the prayers and spoke of him, Ernst Muller, who was taken from us nearly 4 years ago, his gentle spirit stole into our midst. On his memorial are inscribed words from the book of Daniel. The wise shall shine as the brightness of the heavens, and they that lead many to righteousness as the stars forever. You know these names of Daniel, of the teachers who with their light are, leading us to, and so on. And then he said, I don't know, Eschelbacher or Reinhardt, he was one of the rare company of wise and humble, saintly souls. He lived somewhat in the clouds. He's one of the very few, perhaps the only one, I have known who can rightly be called a mystic. The immediacy of his spiritual experience was unmistakable. He was the real Anaf, poor in the world, humble, pious, intimate through a still small voice to a power mightier than all the winds, the shocks and the fires of the world. The wonderful report in New London Jewish Congregation member letter, 31 of July 1958. Yes, this for ending this contribution in memory of Ernst Müller. Thank you very much for listening. And now it's free here for Constanza Kalix, who will lead us to his book, Introduction to the Zohar, and opening a window to his inner work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good evening here at the House Maryon, and welcome for those who are somewhere else. And after this image of this person, Ernst Muller, I would like to continue now with these studies he made on the Zohar. And maybe before I go into that, I would like just to mention again, we heard it before, that this lecture is in the series of the lectures given by the General Anthroposophical Section, the Department for Anthroposophy at the Goetheanum in the School for Spiritual Science. And this lecture series started in 2021 with the Jewish Humanism from Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig. And later, the year later, we had lectures and also publications about Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, Primo Levi, and Simone Weil. And then in 2023, we studied Gustav Landauer. We had also presentations on Paul Celan, Emmanuel Levinas, and Margaret Sussman, as well as Maria Darmstädter. And last year, we heard about Margaret Sussman and Franz Kafka. And this year, as we heard before, about Gershom Scholem, and now Hugo Bergmann, and now Ernst Muller. And with this, we have a long series of these unbelievable contributions on humanism. We would say a choir of voices for the reality of the human being. And in these specific lectures, which the choice was to hear these voices coming from the Jewish culture. And in this with these last persons, Scholem, Bergmann, Ernst Muller, we have people who met Rudolf Steiner, who had knowledge of some or many of his writings, of his lectures, and in a certain sense there was a dialogue that we can hear and maybe make clear and understandable, or at least visible today, maybe even more than it was possible 100 years ago. Yeah, and also in this sense, I would like to introduce some of the thoughts on Ernst Müller's Zohar studies, but to start, and maybe because it's not well known by all, or maybe yes, to say some words as an introduction to what is this book, the book Zohar, as already was mentioned before. His studies on the Zohar, Ernst Müller's studies on the Zohar, are still being published in German. And if you see this book, maybe I can show it here shortly. This is from 1993, and it's the Zohar and his writings, an introduction in the Kabbalah. And if you read what's on the cover, it's written that this is the only German author and scholar who published very first these mystical studies on the Zohar. So the validity of these studies is still recognized, still valid. Yeah, so, and the Zohar is one of the three holy or main books of Judaism, of the Judaism teachings. And the first, of course, is the Torah, the teaching, the instructions, consisting of the books of Moses. And we know very well, at least the first of them, the so-called Old Testament. We have the Genesis, the creation, and the story of the patriarchs. And then we have the second book, the book Exodus, the whole going through the Sinai, and also the commandments. And then we have the other books, also the book of the desert wanderings, the book of Moses' last speeches, the repetition of the law, and finally Moses' death. So all of them together, these books built the Torah. And the history and the origins of the Torah is very, very old, and the becoming of this text from oral tradition to a text, to a written text in Hebrew language, is from the 10th to the 5th century before Christ. So very, very, very old books, very old wisdom. And then we have the Talmud. The Talmud contains the elaboration of the ethical tradition and also started in a long oral tradition. It was written between the 5th and the 2nd centuries before Christ, partly in Hebrew and partly in Aramaic language. And then we have the Zohar, this mystical philosophical exegesis, and it's uncertain where is the place of origin of this book. I will come back about this point together. In any case, what is known is that it clearly appeared in the 13th century in the form of the Spanish Kabbalah. And the language was Aramaic and also quotes in Hebrew. I will come back to the story of this book later in the writings of Ernst Muller. But it's also something that was studied a lot, that traditionally this work was attributed to a 2nd century prophet, Shimon bar Yochai, and that this was the beginning of that what then later would become the book Zohar. It's also not a book that was just written at once, but lots of different narratives came together, and in a certain sense this book was built through the centuries. There are central concepts that are nowadays also more or less well known, and one of them is the Ein Sof, this inexpressible light of God, an infinite and not expressible light of God. And another concept or another content is the Sephirot, with his 10 divine emanations, and this is given as a structure of creation. And I made a little Sephirot symbol here without the Hebrew letters, just for us to have an impression of that. And the concepts that are written here are the concepts suggested for us to study the Sephirot tree, suggested by Hugo Bergmann in the introduction he wrote to the studies on the Zohar written by Ernst Muller. So, for us to have a little image of this very important book. And now I would like to start not with the studies of Ernst Muller on the Zohar, but on the book he published years later, as we heard, 1932, and these were translations on selected texts from the Zohar according to the original text. And in this publication, Ernst Muller writes he writes an introduction, and I would like to quote some little passages on this introduction. And he says that one of the most important things of the Kabbalah, there are two main important things in the Kabbalah, and one is connected to the language, the other is connected to the fact that everything is related to the human being. So I quote him now from this introduction: "The creative power of the primordial sounds and the orientation of the entire cosmos towards the human being. These are the central elements of the content of the Zohar. The ancient doctrine of the world-creating Word, which also appears in Indian, ancient Greek, Alexandrian, and Christian traditions, which is the foundation of the biblical account of creation in particular, is developed here into a system that includes the meaning of the name of God, the star-determined organization of the world, the elements of nature, and the microcosmic secrets of the human organism. So we see here that he says the two main elements are, on one hand, the Word, and the Word as the creation power of the world, and the other is this absolute relation, even of God, of the meaning of God, to the reality of the human being. And, I quote again, at the center of the world's effects stands the human being, who is regarded neither as the mere physical organism of the materialists, nor as the abstract thinking being of the idealists, but as the focal point of the active creative forces, as a being who, standing between the upper and the lower worlds, also has a redemptive world mission to fulfill with his own path to salvation. The powers of nature and spirit meet in him. With his body, he belongs to the former, with his spiritual breath to the latter. The soul forms his own center. But in a mysterious way, the whole of humanity appears to be bound to a common origin and a common goal. Yeah, this is from the introduction. Also now he will write in the very end of this introduction something regarding, in a certain sense, the power that relies into a writing as the Zohar. He writes, "For the future aspect of humanity, however, the same principle applies as for the human individual being, namely that its ascent must be brought about from below and from above, in that the free impulses of the aspiring human world draw the active powers of grace from above. So that the existence of the human being is essential also to draw the active powers of grace." And I will come back to that more to the end of this short introduction to these studies. And now I would like to go to this book published by Ernst Muller. The first edition was published 1920, we heard that before, and the second 1923. And then there was an edition published 37 years later, when Ernst Muller was already dead, and with a foreword by Hugo Bergmann. Hugo Bergmann, as we remember, we heard by Peter Selk, was a very close friend to him, and both of them, they started together to read and to study the Zohar. And in this introduction of Hugo Bergmann points different things very clearly out, and he will point out something that is very central, I think, and that is the relation in between the knowledge and the studies of Ernst Muller on anthroposophy and his studies of the Zohar. And I will quote some parts of that, but before, he also in this introduction, this foreword, he will say very clearly that at the same time as Ernst Muller published this second edition of this book on the Zohar, Gershom Scholem was already also studying and publishing about Jewish mysticism. And this is something very interesting because it was due to Gershom Scholem that Jewish mysticism entered in the fields of academic studies. Until then, it was not part of the academic discourse. And for that, Gershom Scholem describes and studies the Jewish mysticism as an object of science. And it is open, or we can see that the question of his own connection to this Jewish mysticism is something that is not belonging, let's say so, on the first layer to this studying in academia. Yeah, and at the same time we have then Ernst Muller entering the realm of this Jewish mysticism with what Hugo Bergman will name kind of a key to open this understanding thanks and through his knowledge of anthroposophy. So I will quote him a little bit, quoting Hugo Bergman in this foreword. At about the same time of the second edition, a young scholar, Gerhard Gershom Scholem, immigrated from Germany to Palestine and turned his attention to the exploration of Jewish mysticism with all the zeal of a highly gifted young man. He had already earned his doctorate in Munich with a German edition of the book Bahir, and then in 1927 he published the Bibliographia Kabbalistica with an appendix entitled Bibliography of the Zohar and its commentaries, published in Leipzig. At that time, Jewish mysticism was, to put it mildly, the stepchild of Jewish scholarship. None of the major Jewish academic institutions gave it a place in research and teaching. We owe our gratitude to Dr. Magnus, the Chancellor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, founded 1925, who has opened to new ideas for creating a chair for Jewish mysticism and entrusting its supervision to Gershom Scholem. And it can be said that Scholem's work and that of his students over the last 30 years has completely changed the picture we had of the history of Jewish mysticism. Yeah, and then he will describe this attitude from Ernst Muller towards the Zohar in connection to Rudolf Steiner. And this I will quote again because this is something that could be also seen with a critical view. But it's very interesting that a scholar and an academic professor, I mean, he was a main professor in the Hebrew University, affirms the endeavor to understand a spiritual content as Zohar with a key, with an instrument of a spiritual perspective as given by anthroposophy. So I quote now, Muller has a very peculiar attitude toward the Zohar and the Kabbalah in general. He does not ask about the historical and sociological aspects, nor is he particularly interested in the differences between the individual layers of Jewish esoteric teaching in their historical development. He sees them as a teaching of the present and endeavors to penetrate the Zohar as if it were a timeless book. The fact that he largely succeeds in this is mainly to the fact that he went through Rudolf Steiner's school. cite a single example when he draws a parallel between the 5 soul members of Jewish mysticism and 5 concepts of Steiner's anthroposophy in a note to the chapter on the realm of morality. Researchers interested purely in history may raise some objections, but today's readers who wonders whether he can do anything with the 5 soul members of Kabbalah will be grateful to him for providing a key that prevents the reader from having to content himself with a purely mechanical enumeration of the soul members. He has been given a hypothesis of heuristic value with which he can try to work. Yeah, so here we see it's a key and a hypothesis of heuristic value. So is the understanding of Hugo Bergmann on this way to deal with the Zohar by Ernst Muller. Yes, and then also a little bit later he writes, another area where his anthroposophical training and way of thinking paved the way for understanding is the correspondence between the human being and the world, the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. And also a significant point should be emphasized. Muller repeatedly emphasized the cooperation between above and below. All development is twofold, the descent of the spirit and the ascent of nature. The blessing from above is conditioned by the effect of man from below. The free impulses of aspiring humanity draw down the active powers of grace from above. This is an idea that has been brought home to today's reader, particularly through the writings also of Sri Aurobindo, as we heard before. It is one of the fundamental ideas of Jewish mysticism, which had significant historical effects in his later history. And then, and just to close the quotations of Hugo Bergmann, he writes about the scientific method. As a scholar, he's interested in the scientific method to understand, to research something as the Zohar, to research this kind of text. And he writes, the Sefirot tree is of great importance not only in terms of content, but also in terms of methodology. It reveals the profound difference between the methods of modern European science and scientific procedures influenced by mysticism. Our science explains horizontally. Its most important category is that of cause and effect, whereby cause and effect must lie on the same level, must have a common denominator, so to speak. However, all phenomena have the deepest level, the lowest level in common. Hence, the endeavor of European science to reduce everything to the lowest level, to explain life through mechanical movement, to explain the human being through the ape and so on. This is the source of the demands of physicalism, which are entirely justified from the standpoint of this method to reduce all phenomena to the level of elementary physical phenomena. The Zohar, on the other hand, explains the world in a vertical direction, from top to bottom. The world is to be understood as a descent of the divine. The rediscovery of the principle of explaining the lower from the higher and the resulting revolution in science and our lives is perhaps the point where we can most readily expect an immediate effect of mysticism on science. And Ernst Muller wanted to pave the way for this new science through his studies. So we see a deep respect and a deep appreciation on this endeavor. Yeah. And now I would like to enter a little bit in the studies of Ernst Muller, and he writes in the foreword to his studies in the first edition in Vienna, he writes in the foreword, a thanks to Martin Buber, to Rudolf Steiner, and to Hugo Bergmann to enable him to do these studies. Good. And now I would like to go into some of the aspects that he will study in this book. And first he will write about the origins of the book. And in writing about the origins, he will say what we already know, so that it's probably the first moment it appears it with the Kabbalist and scholar Moses ben Leon in the 13th century, and that this disseminated what was meant to be a work of Rabbi Simon ben Yochai, one of the greatest Talmudic authorities of the 2nd century. But he also writes the opinions of others, and now I would like to say that he writes that Gustav Landauer considered the Zohar to be the work of Abraham Abulafia, one of the most peculiar Kabbalistic figures of the 13th century. So he includes other views on that. And then he writes, one can imagine the Zohar having a similar origin to that of the Talmud, which has been passed down orally for centuries before being written down, growing in size from generation to generation. So it is a common work of different generations. Yeah. Then also in his introduction, he writes a very interesting perspective, that he says it is a peculiar phenomena of the Jewish intellectual history that twice it happens at the same period, the mystical and the rationalistic elements reaching their highest development in a very close succession. And that happens, as an example, in the 12th and 13th centuries, in this era in which we see the beginning of the written Zohar, at the same time as the philosophical approaches given by Maimonides. And then later we will see that in the 19th century, with the beginnings of Hasidism, at the same time, almost at the same time, this renewal or knowing again of Hasidism with Mendelssohn's Enlightenment. As a very interesting fact, a peculiar phenomena, he will write, of Jewish intellectual history. Yeah. From the teachings of the Zohar, he will write about the work of God. The work of God, and he starts saying that in the language of the mysticism, it is impossible to speak of an ultimate element at all. And he says that even in the Kabbalah, the concepts are very difficult. The names of God, how to name this principle of God, is something very, very difficult. And he says, I quote, above all nameable categories of existence stands only the Ein Sof, that means the infinite, and the Ayin, the nothingness. So that this divine is very difficult to be named, and the concepts that we have are the infinite and the nothingness. And he writes, it is not yet the beginning of this beginning, but it is itself exalted above all beginnings. Thus, in this, it's something called the beginning and the not beginning. Yeah, the beginning and the not beginning. This unnameable, infinite and nothingness. And then he will write about this Sephirot, this tree, and he will describe it very precisely. And I want just to mention very few aspects in this context, and this is that the main or a main quality of this tree is that all the parts are deeply connected. So the first triad, the second triad, and the third triad, they are totally related one to the other. We have also the right part, the left part, the middle part, and they belong one to each other. Yeah, and so he writes that we have here the first, or in the upper level, we have the crown as this beginning of all creation. And here we have the kingdom, also the spiritual human kingdom. This is the kingdom to which we refer as it is meant in the Christian Lord's Prayer. And he writes, the spiritual regions, they are directly in touch and they surround the human beings. However, the gradation does not actually imply a higher or a lower value, and since the crown contains the whole tree in an embryonic form, the whole tree appears again condensed in the kingdom. So we have the whole tree in embryonic form in the crown. At the same time, we have the whole tree condensed in the kingdom. Thus, the first and the 10th Sephirot are also often directly connected. And then he will describe these trinities. He says in the Supreme Trinity, we have the essential powers of knowledge. And if we look to these essential powers of knowledge, immediately we can be astonished, because we have on one hand wisdom, and on the other hand, at the same layer, at the same level, ordering reason. So wisdom, and then this capacity to order, the ordering reason. In the middle Trinity, he says, we have the primal powers of spiritual life. And essentially we have love, mercy, and justice. And he will say that strength, beauty, and the creative bond are all given then in the relation, in the immanent relation on one to the other. And in the third Trinity, exactly, we have these relations given as primordial powers of our vital existence, of our earthly existence, we can also say. And he writes, the third Trinity contains the primordial powers of vital existence, the natural kingdom, strength, beauty, and as a creative bond from the lower primordial ground, the physical power of procreation, in which strength and beauty appear fused in a germinal form, and which therefore forms the foundation for both, and indeed for the whole tree, insofar as its meaning lies in the manifestation of the spirit into the physical nature. The meaning lies in the manifestation of the spirit into the physical nature. Yeah. And then he will write about the human being, the realm of the human being. And he writes about the word human in the Kabbalah. I want to quote it, as in almost all mystical teachings, but in an even more far-reaching sense, the word human in Kabbalah encompasses a realm that far surpasses all ordinary scientific or historical experience of human beings, as well as ethical or religious formulations of humanity. Indeed, one can say that the teaching about the human being in turn contains the entire teaching of the Zohar condensed in a mysterious way. So the teaching of the human being contains the entire teaching of the whole Zohar in a very mysterious way. And for the Zohar, God needs the human being to be completed. So the human being is not only a result of God's creation, but it's a necessary base for the realization of that what God is. And I quote, "The tremendous central importance that the Zohar attaches to the human beings is expressed in statements according to which our world only exists through the creation of men, that only with it is the name of God completed, that only with the appearance of men does the becoming visible, that is, the physical creation of all other beings could begin. Only with the creation of the human being." And I would like now to shortly read one of the texts that in the end of this book about the introduction on the Kabbalah, he put some translations of little parts of the book Zohar. And I would like at that point to read one of these little texts, and the title is Man as the Center of Creation. And we will hear it now. These are the stories of the Kabbalah. We need to remember that all of them are coming from oral tradition. We hear the oral way in this written text, translated here by Ernst Muller. Rabbi Shija began with the sentence, "The buds have become visible on the earth. The time of the nightingale has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land." All this refers to the creation of the world. At that time, the Most Holy One placed the entire host of growing beings into the earth. It was in the earth, but did not produce any visible shoots until man was created. Only when man was created did everything become visible in the world. The earth revealed its shoots, and with them the hosts of beings entrusted to it. Nor did the heavens give any power to the earth until man appeared. And every plant of the field was not yet on the earth, and every herb of the field had not yet grown, for Yahweh Elohim had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. All those beings remained hidden, and even the heavens were inhibited in their effect until man appeared. Then immediately the buds became visible on the earth. The hidden beings became apparent. The time of the nightingale has come, for then the statue of the songs of praise before the Most Holy One was established, which had not happened before man was created. And the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. This is the word of the Most Holy One, which was not yet in the world before man was created. And when men become a visible being, all this become visible. Yeah, so we see here with this example, this deep perspective of the Zohar, that the human being is a ground for the creation and not only a result of God's creation. He will write about the eye in the Kabbalah, but now I would like to go a little bit to an end, and I want to quote something that he will write about the miracles in the Zohar. And Ernst Muller will write that miracles and wonders are only needed for those who are not seeing the wonder and the miracle of our daily life. And this is also very deep connected to the Kabbalah, the deep respect and the awe and the relation to that what's human on earth. I quote him now: "Miracles and wonders are only needed by those who have no organ for the most powerful miracle, everyday world events, and for the true miracle of human beings, their daily actions united with God. Nevertheless, both already signify the revelation of a wonderful connection between the lower and the upper worlds, which also naturally includes the realm of supersensible effects. This living, active connection, however, arises directly from the entire Kabbalistic world picture in the form of the mutual correspondence and interaction of the upper and the lower worlds." So miracles are only needed by those who are not able, who have no organ for this most powerful miracle, the everyday world's events, and for the true miracle of the human being, that is their daily actions united with God. Yeah, so maybe this as a first glimpse on these studies on Ernst Muller, on the Kabbalah. And to close, I would like to read one more little text of this selection of text that he put in the end of his book. Rabbi Isaac opened one of his lectures with the passage, "How many are your works, Lord? You have made them all with wisdom. The earth is full of your creatures." This sentence has been interpreted many times. Who can count the works of the Most Holy? How many heavenly hosts and multitudes are there, innumerable, and yet all at once and all together, like a hammer that sparks in all directions at the same time. In the same way, the Holy One, blessed he be, brings into being so many hosts and multitudes of beings, each distinct from the other, innumerable and yet existing at the same time. But note the following: through the Word and through the breath, both in one, the world was made. And it is said in the Psalms, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, by the breath of his mouth all their host." The one does not proceed from the original source without the other, and both are completed by the other. And from them proceed so many hosts and legions, multitudes and submultitudes, all united in time. And note also the following: when the All-Holy One was creating worlds, He led forth an hidden light. From his springs forth all those lights that become manifest. First, the other lights unfold and create themselves from this light. They form the upper world. But that highest light spread even further and formed a kind of light that does not shine, and this is the foundation of the lower world. And this not shining light, as it needs connection with the upper world in order to shine, can only do so through the mediation of the lower world. From the connection with the upper world, however, numerous other hosts and multitudes of beings arise who are subservient to the higher ones. And that is why it is said, "How many are your works, Lord? You have made them all in wisdom. The earth is also full of your own." What is on earth is also in the heavens. There is no thing in this world, however small, that it's not dependent on a being set above it. And when the lower thing is set in motion, so is the higher thing that is set above it, for everything is interconnected and is united. Yeah, so I hope you could have an impression this evening or today about Ernst Muller and a little glimpse on these studies he made on Zohar. And I want to thank you here at House Maryon very much for coming and in your places for hearing that. And we are very grateful if you support the work of the General Anthroposophical Section also with a little donation. Thank you very much.